So Lauren Winter, who is an Episcopal priest, professor of Christian spirituality at Duke University, tells a story about a 12-year-old named Julian who told her father, who happened to be a pastor, that she really couldn't go forward with confirmation because she wasn't sure she could promise to believe everything she was supposed to believe forever. Preacher's kids, right? I have a couple of them. Her father replied, though, much wiser than I am probably, "What you promise when you are confirmed is not that you will believe this forever. What you promise is that this is the story that you will wrestle with forever." The story you will wrestle with forever. Now, I've often found there is an assumption among some people, particularly young people, who perceive that those who attend church have a surety about what they believe. Whether that belief, it might be something rooted in a traditional creed or traditional confession, whether that is a belief in the inerrancy of the Bible, whether that is a belief is walking around without doubt or walking around without doubt or uncertainty. Now, underneath this perceived conception of churchgoers, sure of their faith, they believe, is that they struggle with whether they believe this or not. They're not sure themselves. Their own doubts, their own uncertainty, whether they belong, right, with the true believers. I try to tell them, just come to our church and you'll see that's not true. Try to tell them that it's really far from the truth, that if they talked with regular churchgoers, regular church people, they would find as many doubts and questions as they have. They would hear people wrestling with questions of life and death, questions of what it means to be good, questions of how to live our lives with integrity and faithfulness. It is not true that the saints of the church unquestionably believe forever. It's just not reality. They are just caught up wrestling with a particular story about God expressed in Jesus the Christ. Now, one of the things I truly love about the Bible is how really human it is. And by that, I mean it doesn't try to avoid the very deeply human questions. Unfortunately, some use the Bible to beat over other people's heads, claims of eternal exclusive truth. But if you actually sat down to read the Bible, you would find very human stories of doubt and uncertainty, human stories of struggles with God, the fumbles and foibles of what it means to be human. I believe, and there are a number of theologians who point out that the Bible is less a book about answers and more a story about the very questions human beings struggle with in their existence. And the story of Lazarus we read this morning is no different. Because it faces one of the most human, most profound questions human beings wrestle with, the reality of death, especially about those we love deeply. Now, on the surface, we might read the story, a simple story where we do know that in the end, Jesus raises Lazarus from the tomb, a miracle, appropriately so, emphasizing the power of God through the Son of God, the power of God to bring life out of death. And that is an important message we should carry in our hearts. It's a reassuring story we all probably really need to experience as death touches our life. But the story, as told by John, is a lot more complex than that. A lot more actually meaningful than that. First, it confronts the profoundly human question of God, of where are you, God? God's seeming absence in times of grief and death. Not once, not twice, but 3 times Jesus is confronted with a question. Where was he when Lazarus died? First, there's Martha, who hears Jesus coming. She goes to him, she meets him, and she asks him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And along comes her sister. And she kneels before him. And she asks him and states the very same truth. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And finally, the mourners who are watching this, who are watching what's going on, the 3rd time says, could he not, who opened the eyes of the blind, have kept this man from dying? It confronts that very human experience in which we could be very angry with God. Where are you? I heard a sermon once, the best title of a sermon. I should have used it and said it was my own. Sermon title that asked the question, when Jesus shows up too late. So to me, this story honors that very human experience in question. Or where are you, God, when those we love die? It does not dismiss, but faces the reality of death. It blatantly asks of Jesus, where were you? If you'd been here, they believe, and probably rightfully so, this would not have happened. It's a question every one of us, if we are but honest in our own lives, especially when a loved one suffers from a horrible disease or someone who dies suddenly, it's a question we ask ourselves, maybe if we're truly honest, why didn't you show up, God, to stop this from happening? And you know what? Truth be told, this story doesn't answer that question. Who's here heard of a book by Rabbi Harold Kushner? Many years ago that really wrestles with this question, and it's often referred to. Harold Kushner was a rabbi whose son, who was born with that disease in which they age prematurely. And so I think his son died by the time he was 12 years old. And Rabbi Kushner was struggling because people would say to him, well, give him theological answers about his profound grief, about the loss of a son. And would ask and tell him, well, maybe God wanted him. And Rabbi Kushner would say, well, that's kind of selfish. I want my son. Would have all these theological answers about why this happened. And he wrote a book and wrestled with that question, and he didn't title the book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, because he argued there is no explanation that makes sense. It's just part of human existence. What he wrote was a book he titled, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. In the appropriate ways, we are present to each other in such tragic and difficult circumstances. When we stand in the tension between life and death, Jesus doesn't answer the question of Mary and Martha or the crowd around him. Instead, he does something I would say is far more profound and meaningful than some theological answer. He grieves. The story says that Jesus, seeing the sadness and mourning around him, the passage goes, and it can be interpreted, he is greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Now, the Greek word here is actually kind of difficult to translate. It also has connotations, this is interesting enough, of anger and pain. In other words, Jesus was moved, disturbed, he was angry, he was in pain. Great description of grief and sorrow. So there's something radical being said here. That the Son of God, the Messiah, grieves. Not a Messiah untouched by human experience, not a Messiah up in the heavens, not a God far away from that human pain and sorrow that is a part of every single person's existence. In fact, I would say, you may not notice, but the shortest line in the Bible, if you look on a trivia, get asked this question, do you know what it was? Jesus wept. Is probably its most theological, profoundly theological. In other words, Jesus wept tells us that God makes sacred that process of grief and sorrow every one of us feel. That God enters that and is present to us, not at some distance, but in the midst of it. We don't like it, but actually, grief and sorrow is a sacred process in which we say goodbye, in which we mourn, in which we acknowledge the love we carried for those around us. The truth is, the cost of love is grief. Are we willing to pay it? To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.